Hi, this is Philosophy81, and today we're beginning the section on Hinduism. So, I would like to recommend that you have your textbook in front of you. A lot of the terms that we will be looking at or using are in Hindi or Sanskrit, and that can be quite confusing and not always um, look the written form may not always look like the form when it's pronounced. So if you have your book in front of you, good, you can kind of follow along. But the other thing to note, if you haven't already, is that in the back of the book, there's not only an index, but there's a glossary. So some of the words that I'll be using or that we'll be using in the course here, you'll be able to look up for proper spelling. Um, I will be giving a vocabulary list later, right before the exam. I don't want to give it to you now because what happens is people take the vocab list and then they listen to the lectures and they just make sure they have the vocabulary list filled out, and then they don't really learn anything. So you need to do the reading and then of course watch these videos, and then when I give you the vocabulary list a couple of days before the exam, you'll be able to fill in the exam from what you actually learned. Okay, so let's get on to Hinduism. Um, Hinduism is actually the combination of the religious beliefs of two different groups: the Indus Valley people, also known as the Harappans, and the Aryans. So we'll begin with a timeline of Hinduism. So your book says, gives you this. We have the pre-Hindu period of 2700 to 1500 BCE, and that was when India was dominated by the Indus Valley people. That has changed. We've now expanded that further back another 500 years to 3200 BCE to roughly 1500 BCE. So we keep learning about these people. Also, then in 1500 BCE, the Aryan people came in and essentially invaded the Indus Valley people. And that led to a domination of religious beliefs that followed the Aryan beliefs. So we call that the Vedic age. What was going on then in essentially in India was the religion of the Aryan people, and their religion was based on writings called the Vedas. That lasted for about 400 years, and then we move into what we call the classical post-Vedic period. So after the Vedas, we had a formulation of three different types of Hinduism, and each one was an attempt to solve the problems of what was going on in the lives of Indian people. So we will step through each of those in the classical period, and then that brings us to the modern period, modern India. The classical period in India of Hinduism ended in 1200 Common Era, because the Muslims invaded and took control of India and insisted that everyone become a Muslim, and so they banned all of the other religions. That lasted for, well, 557 years to 1757 Common Era, when the British took control. And the British invaded, took control of India, ruled India for nearly 200 years, and they did not enforce their religion. Um, they removed the ban on other religions, and what we see in under the British rule was a reemergence of the Hinduism that had, originated in India. Then in 1947, a revolution led by Gandhi gained freedom of India from the British, and India is now an independent country. And at this point, religiously, which is what we are talking about, um, India is about 85% Hindu. So all of the other religions, or the other religions that came in trying to supplant Hinduism, have been forgotten or put to the side, and about 85% of the country has returned to Hinduism. The remaining 15% is made up of about 13% Muslims, and the remaining 2% is a mixture of Buddhists and Christians. So again, dominated by Hinduism. Now, when we're talking about India, okay, as you have your book in front of you and you see, oops, let's see, this camera is so backwards to me. Sorry. You see, well, India, and here in this particular picture, there isn't a drawing of the various countries, okay? It just has this continent. And that's good because actually when we look at India in the past versus India today, there are some lines that have been drawn. So for example, this area all along here, oops, yeah, all along here, okay, that is the Indus Valley. It's the origin of the Indus Valley people, of course. It is the origin of culture in India, and it is where India gets its name, the Indus Valley, and therefore India. However, today that is not India. Today that area is Pakistan. So what happened is when the country returned to becoming largely Hindu, a lot of Muslims were displaced and moved over either into the Indus Valley, or they were moved over here into the Punjab, and then the Indus Valley became the separate country of Pakistan, and which is a Muslim country today. So when we're talking about early India, we're actually talking about what is now known as Pakistan. Okay, so along the Indus Valley there, modern day Pakistan, we had a group of people called the Harappans, or the Indus Valley people. And again, we've been able to trace them back to 3200 BCE, so just over 5,000 years. That's pretty phenomenal. And there are good chances that the culture actually goes back further than that. It's just we haven't discovered it. We haven't dug down deep enough and paid that much attention. So your textbook does say 2700 BCE, but again, we keep finding new things. Your textbook will also tell you we don't know what happened to the Harappan people or the Indus Valley people. They just kind of disappeared. Well, now we know. We've been able to use climate records and discovered that the monsoons, which used to rain against northern India and um, provide all of the food for the crops and such, shifted and started moving to the east. And as it moved to the east, these huge settlements that had grown up around the Indus Valley River weren't able to support the people that lived there in terms of providing food and crops. So as the monsoons traveled, the people traveled. So the people abandoned some of the settlements along the Indus Valley to follow the monsoons. However, plenty of people stayed. So we've solved that mystery, and I'm sure we will eventually solve some of the other mysteries having to do with the Indus Valley people. But here's what we know about them. They were agricultural and built cities, and they were isolated, which is important. So if you look again at this map, okay, and you can see here, there's the settlements of Harappa up here. Oops, again, sorry about this, Harappa up here, and then down here near the closer to the coast, Mohenjo-Daro, which was another big settlement. Two huge settlements. And they were isolated in the sense that, here we go, to the south, there were wide plains. People didn't travel. Any people that had come along from Mohenjo-Daro and came down and maybe settled down here, they didn't travel back up in big numbers. So there were no threat to the people in the settlements. And then up here on the other side of the Indus Valley River were mountains, high mountains, big mountains. And so the people on the other side, for the most part, weren't a threat either. So they were isolated and they were safe. That allowed them to not have to focus on warfare or defending themselves. They could focus on things like food production and social engineering, things like architecture, art, even. So that was impressive. They were also one of the most extensive of the world's early cultures. I mean, we think about India and we know that they've been around a long time, but we don't think about there having been these extremely large and advanced civilizations. So at one point, 10% of the world's population was living along the Indus Valley River, and that's pretty impressive, I think. They also rivaled Egypt for power. We always look back and we think of Egypt and all of their construction techniques and how extensive they were. Well, the Indus Valley people were just as advanced. They had a widespread population. It was huge. They again, they were agrarian, with cows and pigs and sheep and chickens and all sorts of plant foods and animals. So they weren't hurting for food, which allowed the population to expand. They had the use of copper and bronze, but they used it for art and for idols and for tools more than they used it for weapons. They didn't need a lot of weapons because they weren't being threatened by anyone. So they were able to develop these extra, again, the art and the idols, as well as tools rather than having to develop weapons. They developed a written language, which was important. They developed a uniform set of measurements and weights. And an unfortunate part of all of this is that we have not yet deciphered their language. Extensive culture, pardon me, an extensive civilization, and they had a written language, and we have found samples of the writing, extensive samples, but we haven't figured out what they were saying. We haven't figured out the language. Now, part of that is because, as a whole, people didn't know that this civilization had existed, or they didn't care. People didn't really start spending time looking at early India until roughly the 1920s. So prior to that, yeah, there was a building over here, but there was a temple over here, but let's tear it down and use it to build a railway, or whatever. It was not being appreciated. And so in the 1920s, there was a lot of excavation in Egypt, and you're probably familiar. They found King Tut. Well, when they found all of the riches of King Tut, it started kind of like a gold rush, right? People were trying to dig up everything. Everything they thought was a tomb could be a tomb, maybe a tomb, and they were trying to find all of these riches. Well, people started to think, okay, if this was going on in Egypt, and we have all of this riches here, what about other countries? So they said, well, I once heard that there was an ancient civilization in India. So what's that about? Let's go over there. So roughly, mid late 1920s, because of this gold quest or treasure quest, they started looking along the Indus Valley, and they found the settlements, and so they realized, yeah, there was something here. They haven't found any major gold and treasure uh, tombs, but they have found there was this extensive civilization. No one has figured out the language yet. My guess will be that somebody, some graduate student, will be, uh, you know, focused on it for his or her dissertation, and perhaps be able to decipher and figure out what what the Harapans had to say. So what that means is most of what we know about the Harapans comes from either the oral traditions that were passed down or things that we have inferred from excavating their sites. For example, we have inferred that they practiced goddess worship and were probably matriarchal or matrilineal. We found that because of all of the symbols worshiping women, um, goddesses of fertility, all of the issues having to do with women and fertility, and that was the focus. We don't see all these statues of, kings and male rulers. Again, it's an inference, but it looks like it's probably a pretty good inference. We also know that they were very appreciative and focused on water, which makes sense because it was the monsoons that gave birth to the civilization. I mean, it was the monsoons that made that area so fertile in terms of growing crops and such, that they were able to develop themselves. So water was very important. Um, we also know that they had um, pretty developed things that other civilizations didn't have. For example, they had an underground sewer system and a water system and flush toilets. Now we're talking 5,000 years ago. If you look at what was going on in Europe 500 years ago, not 5,000, right? So, I mean, think about London 500 years ago. People had buckets, basically, or pans that they used for toilets, and the streets would have gutters on either side. And generally in the streets, so it was the urban area, or pardon me, the metropolitan area, and the stores would be along the bottom row, but the second story was the living quarters. And what people did is they used these chamber pots to go to the bathroom, and then they would go to the window and they would, yell, basically, if they were kind, look out below, and then they would throw it out the window or empty it out the window, hoping it would find its way into the gutters and drain out. That was 500 years ago, and that's as advanced as Europeans were. In India, they had flush toilets, and by flush toilets, I don't mean with the handle and all of that, but essentially it was a sewer line that ran underground and behind each house. Houses were built in rows to facilitate the sewer system. We know that. We've dug them up, right? And there were platforms, basically, or ledges with holes in them that would lead or led to a little pipe-like thing that went into the sewer. So here's what happened. You would go to the bathroom, or you would use the facility there, and then you'd take a jug of water and pour it down, which would wash it off in or wash it out into the sewer system, and that would travel on down the sewer, and then you'd put generally a wood or a mat cover over the hole, and you'd flushed the toilet, and you had running water coming into your house through separate pipes and a sewer system. 5,000 years ago. I think, and this is kind of a joke, but I actually believe this, that that may be one of the indicators that the society was ruled by women, because one of the things that women tend to want to do is establish some sort of uh, toilet kind of facility. So it may have been what happened. They were also very well planned, and part of it was, again, the sewer and water systems. You've got the pipes and the sewer pipes running in straight lines, and so houses were built on straight lines on a grid system, which is different than how a lot of civilizations start their housing or their villages. For the most part, they, build a city, or pardon me, they build a house, and then they build another house over here, and then maybe one down here, and it's all kind of random, and it depends on where people want to, oh, where's there a good view, or where's it close to water, or whatever. That's not what happened here. They planned it out on grids. There were streets and cross streets, and the water pipes and the sewage pipes followed along those streets. And when a house was built, it was built along those streets because of the water and sewage systems. So they were very well laid out, and the whole city planning was maximized. We're going to have a central area of shopping, and so people can buy food and such from the market, and then that's surrounded by homes, and everything's on this grid pattern so that everybody has water and sewage available. And it seemed to have worked quite beautifully because they continued to do it. In other words, when a part of the city would break down, or they would have areas that would collapse or crumble, they built exactly the same on top of it. And as we dig further and further, we basically find levels of the same thing. So like I said, we've gotten to 3200 BCE, and we may even get further back after that. Something else we've inferred, but is probably true, is that they had a non-violent rule. In other words, we we have not found any areas within the cities or even nearby um, of prisons or massive jail systems, anything like that. We have found large granaries, large, what had to have been communal granaries. So social control, in other words, getting people to follow the rules and play nice with others, was probably dependent on the distribution of food. So with these huge granaries, people contribute, probably in some type of taxation system, the grains that were raised. It may have been a communal system where it wasn't actually taxed, but people all contribute all of the farming to the common good. But anyway, the collective food here was distributed to the citizens. And what happens with this is that you can control population because you can say, look, you haven't been pulling your share of the weight, or you stole from somebody, or you violated something, and so we're going to withhold your portion of food for this day or this week or this month. So people followed the rules and stayed in line in order to get the food that they held communally, and it was a non-violent rule. Um, Nature seems to have been viewed as feminine. Again, a lot of the art had to do with women and fertility, and this reverence for water. So nature was an important thing, and of course, I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? You live in nature. You don't have technology really, so nature is important. What we also infer that is that the religion and worship of these various goddesses was trying to find solutions to practical issues. They were looking for tranquility. They were looking for society to be running smoothly, and it looks like self-examination was the emphasis. They were looking to themselves, what can I do to make society better? They were also apparently trying to affect nature to a certain extent. When the monsoons came, it was good, but you don't want them to flood too much and wash all of the homes away. You just want them to flood enough to supply all of the water that is necessary to run the city and grow the crops. So they had what looked like a really good life. It seemed like everything was running along smoothly. However, by the 1500s, actually beginning around the 1900s BCE, um, people began following the monsoons and leaving some of the settlements. So the settlements had reduced in size, but they were still thriving. There was no doubt about that. They were still quite comfortable lives. They just had fewer people, and those people had gone off into the eastern part of India, as we know India today. Well, what happened then is around the 1500s, a group called the Aryans, or the Aryas, moved into India, or current day Pakistan. The Aryans were from the Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, what we refer to as the Middle Eastern area. And they were made up of 5 independent tribes. The Aryans were nomadic. They did not build cities. They roamed about. They were conquerors, and so when they needed something, they might conquer a village or a people and take what they need. They were definitely patrilineal and patriarchal. We know that from the writings. They were less advanced in science and art than the Harapans. They used their skills in metalwork to make tools and weapons. And they were conquerors. So, of course, they were warriors. They needed weapons. And since they traveled, they didn't have the time to make art, really. They also had something that other people didn't have. They had horses. Um, well, yes, other people had them, but the Harapans didn't. And so, with their horses, the tribes came across the mountains into the Indus Valley, and it doesn't look like there was a big battle. It doesn't look like the Harapans put up a fight. It looks like what happened is that the Aryans showed up. There was a lot of empty space because the Indus Valley people had been leaving to go follow the monsoon. And so it looks like the Aryan people settled in and non-violently, basically, or perhaps with threats, but not carrying them out, took over the settlements of the Indus Valley people. Um, they did not have a written language. They had a language, of course, but it was not written down. They had not figured out a way to write these things down. Now, I find this part a little confusing, but what happened is that since the Harappans had a written language, the Aryans said, create a written language for us. Okay. It seems to me like, if the Aryans had a word for tree and the Harappans had a word and a written symbol for tree, right? That they would just say, well, here's the symbol that you need, and they would drop the Harappan language and start using the Aryan language. But that's not what happened. They created a separate language entirely on its own. We now call that language Sanskrit. It is the first early written form of Hindi, which is the spoken language of India. And it's kind of like you would look back at maybe Old English, and you look at it and you go, that I don't know what those words are. So language evolves. But we do know that it's not the same as the Harappan language. So an entirely new language was created for the Aryans, and now they had a written language. Um, they were also, the Aryans, philosophically simple in the sense that um, they were not preoccupied or really concerned with what happens after death. They weren't concerned about, the cosmogony or the creation of the world. They were concerned about their earthly lives right here in the now. They were looking for common sense eras, right? They wanted to know things like, uh, you know, uh, will this battle be good? So, will our God help us win this battle? Help us fight off our enemies. Help us conquer these people. Those kind of things. I need my child who was injured to be healthy. Can we take care of that? They really weren't concerned so much about what happens. What's my soul about? Where did we come from? What happens after we die? So. So they worshipped gods that were written about in their writings. Again, those are called the Vedas. And were trying to find solutions to natural problems or moral problems or militaristic threats. And they also had something um, we call social ranks to begin with, but ultimately becomes called the caste system. But they had three social ranks. In other words, people were put into three classes. So you had the Brahmin. Brahmin spelled with a small b, r, a with an accent over it, Hmans. We're going to have three different spellings of the word Brahmin, and the accents or the capitalization of the first letter make significantly different meanings. So you need to make sure that you get this. Brahmins with a small b and an accent over the a. These were the priests, basically, the priestly guild. So they were the holy people. They weren't the largest group. They weren't actually the rulers, but they advised the second social group, which was the warriors, because the warriors were made up of the generals and so forth, but also the rulers proper, like if there was a king, that kind of thing. He was a warrior, and he got advice from the Brahmins. So we have the Brahmins as the highest and best rank, but not the largest or most powerful, followed by the warriors who actually ran everything, and then thirdly was the general population. So that would be everybody else. If you're not a warrior, ruler, or a Brahmin, you're a part of the general population. These three ranks were not hereditary. In other words, you had flexibility. If you were a warrior and you wanted to become a Brahmin, or you didn't like being a warrior and you wanted to become a horse trainer, whatever that might be, you had flexibility. You weren't born into your class. That will change. So the Aryans, looking for solutions to everyday world, and again, ruled by warriors. So they had a particular worldview that was different. And they came in from uh, Iran and Afghanistan into the Indus Valley, and probably did not massacre the Indus Valley people, but again, just took over in terms of becoming the dominant group. Now, when they settled and mingled with the Indus Valley and then eventually took over the rule, a couple of things happened. One, the Aryan language completely replaced the Indus language. Even though there was that weird thing with the Indus people helping them figure out how to write the Aryan language, the Indus Valley language completely disappeared. It fell out of use, which is why we can't decipher it today. So the Aryan language, which eventually becomes called Hindi, and in an early form is called Sanskrit, that takes over. And the religious views of the Aryans um, took over. So now you've got this blend of people. You've got the Aryans and the Indus Valley people, and they are following the religion of the elite Aryan, so the Brahmins, and bringing in little pockets and little snips here and there of the Indus Valley people religion. Those pockets of the Indus Valley culture and religions survived. I mean, people remembered. It's not like, the Aryans came in, they went, oh, forgot everything. They remembered, and it influenced the Aryans, and the ideas over the next 1,000 years or so began to get blended. Now, that will ultimately lead to what we know as Hinduism. Right now, we're still talking about the Vedic period, the material that is written in the Vedas that comes from strictly the Aryans. Okay, so the Vedas, the writings of the Aryans. The Vedas were not originally written down because the Aryans had no written language. So it was oral literature, oral tradition that was composed by the Brahmin and was used for rituals, basically. And it began about 1200 BCE in terms of getting collected and written down. So about 300 years after they've come into the Indus Valley. But the oral scriptures had been part of Aryan culture as far back as anyone could remember. And there are four main Vedas, and they well, the term Veda means wisdom. It's the sacred wisdom of the Aryans. So four oral traditions that were sung, all of them were sung, well, one of them wasn't. They were sung and memorized and passed on to other people, passed on to children usually, passed on to younger, and it was carried on for centuries like that. So the oldest of the Vedas is called the Rig Veda. It is a collection of hymns, again, songs, and praise, with a full quarter of it devoted to Indra, their chief god or king of the gods. So Indra was the main god, one of two gods that were important. He's the king of rain, or the god of rain, the god of thunder, and he controlled and defended the rain. But he was the protector of the people from outside threats, including natural threats. So he was the one that they would go to when they were going to plan a battle, or when they were about to be attacked, or when there was some other kind of external threat, like weather or thunder and flooding and that sorts. So there are over 1,000 hymns collected in the Rig Veda, and again, a full quarter of them are directly to Indra, speaking about Indra, how much he has helped the people, how awesome he is, how powerful he is, and the rest were songs of praise to various other gods and descriptions of rituals, how they needed to be carried out. Because the way you communicate with a god frequently is through some sort of ritual. So that's what the Rig Veda was. Started off with praise, so praise and rituals. Following that, we have the Sama Veda. The Sama Veda was mostly taken from the Rig Veda, and it was collected and basically rememorized in the order in which they would be sung during the rituals. So if you think about, like, if you think about a modern wedding, right? There's usually an officiant there standing in front of the bride and the groom, or the two grooms or the two brides, and standing there with a book, and he or she is reading through the ceremony. And it's not something that, oh, I've got to read it because I don't know it. It's just to make sure that it goes in the right order, right? And so it's kind of like a little cheat sheet or handy book. That's what the Samaveda essentially is. It's the rituals that were originally in the Rig Veda that have been collected and used, or remembered in ways that they would be used. So it's what the priests say, what the priests do during the ritual, so that they don't make a mistake. Because if you're making a mistake trying to enlist the help of a god and you screw it up, that's going to be a problem. Okay. The third one is the Yajurveda. About half of it was taken from the Rig Veda, because it's having to do with rituals, and half was is new compositions that were prose. They were not sung. Your textbooks, your textbook refers to them as the mutterings of the altar boys, and that's really essentially what they were. The advaryus, or the altar boys, would be setting up. So if you're setting up a ritual in which, say, a sheep or a bull is going to be sacrificed, you have to have the sacrificial knife. You have to have perhaps the chalice that will collect blood that might be used in the ceremony. You have to have a place to tie up the animal. You might even need to bring out the animal before the priest gets there. You've got assorted towels to clean things. You've got a whole lot of different things that need to happen. And if it's going to be a burnt offering, there's got to be the fire. There's got to be the things to burn the animal. So all of these preparations for the offerings and ceremonies and rituals were repeated in these short mutterings by the altar boys, so that they would do it right. Now I'm putting the knife here, and next to it is the chalice, those kind of things, so that they didn't leave out a part. Again, screwing up a ritual might not only not get you what you wanted, but might get you very, very big trouble. Okay, so the Yajurveda was that way of checking that the altar boys were doing the right thing. Lastly, but not leastly, we have the Atharva Veda. Now, the Atharva Veda is also known as the Arya Veda, which is perhaps a little easier to remember. And here's what happened. As the power of the priests became seen as crucially important, they decided they needed supervisor priests to make sure that ceremonies were being done. It's going along with this theme I've been talking about, that you have to do the rituals, the sacrifices, the ceremonies properly, or big trouble. So to make sure that the priest himself was doing it properly, other priests were set to become, like, the observer, who would make sure there were no problems, make sure it was all done correctly. So eventually that job moved away from the priest and to the Artarvans. The Artarvans were the medical experts. Basically we'd look at them as the doctors, except that they used a lot of spells and incantations. So the Atharva Veda, or the Ayurveda, is made up of the teachings and the lore, the prescriptions, the incantations that were used by the Artarvans. So it was not for public ritual at all. It was definitely esoteric, but it was incorporated into the Vedas as the fourth Veda, and considered important, because one of the things that they did is that, well, the Brahmins are trying to make everything in the world work well, and they're doing it by trying to invoke the help and the the works of the gods. But they're also realizing that when people were sick and there were things that were well, things that were wrong with them, they needed spells and incantations and needed to invoke the help of the gods to help cure these people. So that's why the Artarvans became part of this, the supervisors of the priests. They became now considered, medical people now became considered Brahmins. So it wasn't just the priests, it was now these supervisor medical people. So we now have the four Vedas. Each of them has a slightly different focus. Each of them is necessary. And from the Vedas, we can learn a lot about what their worldview was like. And the Vedic worldview, which is called what? Cosmology, not cosmogony. So the Vedic cosmology, we've learned, was about maximizing earthly life. Again, no deep questions about cosmogony or the creation story, or basically even the essence of humanity. It was more important to control what was going on in the world. And so we have a couple of concepts that come up here. One is the word prana, Prana, with an accent over the first A, which means breath, but it's not just air. It's your vital breath. It is the fundamental animating practice, you could say, or that's what they said. In other words, they realized that if you don't have breath, you don't have life. So it is breath that keeps you alive. Prana is your fundamental life-giving principle. And when it is gone, you are gone. The second part, and this rides along with it, is the idea of Atman, Atman. Atman is, well, they refer to it as the subtle substance. We could call it soul, perhaps, our spiritual essence. It is different from prana, but it is just as necessary as prana. The breathing keeps the mind and body alive. The Atman is the soul that inhabits the mind and body. So what happens is that when the person dies, when a person dies, and that last breath leaves their body, the soul, or the Atman, hitches a ride on that breath and also leaves the body. So a dead person is no longer who they were. They are just flesh and bones. There's no soul. There's no animating principle. But the prana, the breath, rises to the sky. Now, the Hindus, pardon me, the Aryans and the Hindus still do, burn their bodies frequently. They have what is called a funeral pyre, Pyre, and the idea is that you have a big fire, and it's a ritual fire, and the body is placed on it. And what happens is that when a person dies and the prana, pardon me, and Atman leave, it kind of floats around him for a little while. It got nowhere to go, right? At first. So you build this big fire, and the more wealthy you are, the bigger the fire. Funny how that is. And what happens is then the body is placed on the firewood, the altar, and it is lit on fire, and the smoke rises to the sky. Well, as the smoke rises to the sky, it carries the prana, and so now the prana goes up into the heavens, and hopefully finds its way into the heavenly, mysterious heavens. And if you have been good and performed your rituals and sacrifices faithfully and been a moral person, then you go into this mysterious heavens and you dwell with the ancestors indefinitely in what is seen as like a perfect version of Earth. So, you know, life's good, you die, you go up, and it's even better. You are there with the ancestors. So it's a view of death that is not something to really dread. Again, it makes a difference if you have money. And of course, if you have not been a moral person and have not acted well and have not performed the rituals and sacrifices faithfully, you won't rise on the pyre and you will just kind of float around the atmosphere forever, which is kind of sucky, I guess. So this fits into the creation story. And the creation story that we get in the Vedas, there are actually a couple, but this cosmogony is from the Rig Veda and one of the more popular ones. So the story goes like this. The god Vishnu appeared before King Bali. King Bali was a Aryan king who was a good king, apparently, but then after he died, he abused his power. But when he died, he had been a good king, and so he was given, I don't know by whom, but he was given the entire universe. There was nothing there but empty space. It was now his to control. And he did, however, abuse his power after he died. Things weren't taken away from him, but the god Vishnu turned himself into a dwarf, a beggar, a poverty-stricken beggar, and he went before the king, King Bali, and said, "Can I have as much space as I can step off with 3 steps?" And Bali was like, "Sure, little guy, no problem. 3 steps, you know, you're this big, right?" So he granted the space of 3 steps to the dwarf, and then the dwarf, who was Vishnu, turned himself back into the true cosmic size of himself and stepped off 3 cosmic realms. Okay, so not the deal Bali expected, but nobody felt bad about it because Bali had been abusing his power. The 3 realms that Vishnu stepped off were first the earthly realm. So you can think of that as like, you know, the earth, the disk that we exist on. Then there was the middle realm that's, you know, went around the earth, that was the atmosphere, and it contained, you know, birds and stars and chariots of the gods, and it had an upper boundary that was the vault of the sky that you could not penetrate. Now it's interesting that they see this atmosphere in a way that is different than ours. I mean, it's just the atmosphere. We have the atmosphere where the birds might fly, right? But stars are not in it. That stars are way in a distant part of it. But they viewed it as all one big section. In other words, it wasn't Earth, and it wasn't the 3rd realm. And the 3rd realm was the highest realm, and that was the mysterious heavens. And that's where the gods lived and the good dead people lived. And so you've got the earth, then the atmosphere, and an impenetrable barrier between the atmosphere and the mysterious heavens. But what happened is that uh, Yama, Yama, the first human, died, and when his soul rose up into the atmosphere on the smoke, right, so his prana and atman are bouncing around, he happened to discover a path or a doorway, gateway into the 3rd realm. And that was the only way to get from the atmosphere into the mysterious heavens. And so from then on, he was tasked with staying by that door. And as other good people died, and their prana rose up on the smoke. If they were very good, he would call them, come on over here. Here's the way into the heavens, so that you can live this, forever life with the ancestors in a perfect heaven. And if the people weren't good and happened to get too close to the gateway, he'd be like, nope, blow them the other way and not let them through. So, that's how or that's how the Vedas describe them. How we get into heaven, what happens in heaven, what happens at death, all of those stories that people are so interested in. Um, they actually have a couple of other creation stories or cosmogonies, but none of them rely on the gods as creators. In other words, there was a primal source that was more of an essence than an entity or a being. Okay? Everything, including the gods, arose from this creative force or this essence, and we will talk about that essence because it gets named later on. But to begin with, there was some sort of creating force that was not a being. It's not like there was a god who made it, but this force, this essence, brought forth the gods and everything else. So that gives us the creation story. I've been talking for about an hour. I'm going to stop this and pick it right back up in a part 2 video. So right now, that's part 1 of Hinduism.